Ali's Gentry traced the holographic interface, her fingers sweeping through cool light. The quantum drive model shimmered with stable energy. A low hum filled the bridge, peaceful routine. She was the drive technician, a title that felt too solid for her real work. Tending to the experimental engine felt like whispering encouragement to a temperamental god. The mathematics were elegant. The application was an art form, a delicate dance with forces humanity barely understood. Captain Eva Rostand stood at the main viewport with her arms crossed. Her reflection was a faint ghost against the cosmic tapestry outside. She was a woman carved from patience. Her calm presence anchored every crew she commanded. The stellar nursery painted the bridge in hues of violet and rose, light from protostars that would not burn for another million years. "Report, Mr. Ames," she said, her voice a low counterpoint to the hum. The man at the long-range sensor array looked up. "Spectrometry is clean, Captain. Just hydrogen, helium, and trace heavy elements. Exactly what the models predicted." She nodded slowly, a small smile touching her lips. A dissonant chime cut through the quiet. Sharp, unwelcome. Gentry leaned in, her brow furrowing as she traced the anomaly through layers of data. The beautiful spiraling model now had a faint, ugly tremor at its center. "Captain," she said, her voice steady but tight, "I am reading a minor power fluctuation in the drive core." Rostand turned from the viewport, her placid expression sharpening. There was no such thing as a minor fluctuation when dealing with forces that held reality together. "What kind of fluctuation?" she asked, moving to stand behind Gentry's chair. "It is unstable," Gentry murmured, coaxing a new diagnostic to life. "The energy draw is oscillating. The pattern is not one I have ever seen." "Run the Level 3 diagnostic, Ms. Gentry," Rostand ordered. "Let us see what is bothering it." Gentry's fingers flew. Her calm focus contrasted with the low thrumming that now vibrated up through the deck plates. The diagnostic was meant to isolate the problem, to cage it in lines of code. Before the program could initialize, the single warning chime became a cacophony. Alarms blared. Red lights strobing across the bridge washed away the soft nebula glow. The vibration intensified into a violent shudder that rattled Gentry's teeth. "It is a cascade failure," she shouted over the noise. "I cannot isolate it." Universe outside the main viewport dissolved. The soft pinks and purples smeared into a nauseating streak of impossible colors. The ship screamed, a tortured groaning of stressed metal from every direction. Gentry fought her console. Her face was illuminated by the stark, failing light. The systems were unresponsive. They were just passengers now. A final bone-jarring lurch threw half the bridge crew from their feet and slammed Gentry against her restraints. Then silence, abrupt, absolute. The alarms died. The strobing lights vanished. The shuddering stopped. The only sound was the ragged, desperate gasps of the crew. Gentry looked up from her dark console, her heart hammering. The low, peaceful hum had returned as if nothing had happened, but everything had. The view outside was wrong. The familiar, gentle glow of the stellar nursery was gone, replaced by a cold, unfamiliar starfield. The constellations were alien, the darkness between them deeper, emptier. "Status report," Captain Rostand commanded, her voice strained but unbroken as she pulled herself to her feet. "Where are we?" The navigation officer stared at his screen, his face pale. "I don't know, Captain," he said, barely a whisper. "The star charts are gone. There is nothing here. Nothing matches." They had made an uncontrolled jump. They were lost. A new presence registered on the proximity sensors, a chime so soft it was almost lost in the stunned silence, a signal where no signal should be. "Something is out there," the sensor officer announced, his voice trembling. "It is big, and it was not there a second ago." Every eye on the bridge turned to the main viewport, searching the empty black. For a long moment, nothing. Then a section of the darkness shifted, a patch of void blacker than the space around it. Lights flickered to life across a surface that had been perfectly cloaked, revealing a shape that defied all human design philosophy. It was a ship, a single colossal vessel hanging in the void before them, so close it filled the entire viewport. A monster of sharp angles and dull metallic plating, scarred and pitted from conflicts the crew could not imagine. No graceful curves, no visible science modules, no consideration for aesthetics. It was built for a single, brutal purpose. The vessel radiated a palpable sense of menace, a silent, predatory stillness more terrifying than any war cry. It was a warship. And it was pointed directly at them. First contact had arrived with the cold, silent promise of annihilation. Subcommander Tyr approached the command throne, his armored feet making no sound on the polished obsidian deck. "War Primus," he began, his voice a clipped, formal baritone. "The analysis is complete. The intruder's energy signature is a mess. We are detecting extreme signature dissonance." This term described a power core operating so far outside stable parameters that it actively fought itself. The ship bled energy in chaotic bursts. It is a miracle their ship did not atomize upon arrival. Hull composition is primitive, minimal defensive plating. No projected energy shielding worth the name. Weapon emplacements are few and appear to be low-yield kinetic drivers. Vorlag processed the information without a flicker of expression. The report confirmed his initial assessment. The ship was insignificant, a gnat in the face of a leviathan. Such a chaotic arrival suggested one of two possibilities. It was either an act of breathtaking incompetence by a species that had just discovered a new, unstable form of travel, or it was a deliberate test, a probe sent to gauge Thorian response time. Both scenarios were equally insulting. One implied they were dealing with fools who stumbled into a predator's den. The other implied an enemy believed they could be tested by such a paltry display. He allowed his mind to drift through the precepts of scale, the foundational text of Thorian military doctrine. A complex calculus of threat-to-response ratios honed over millennia. A lesser commander, driven by ego or passion, might have ordered immediate destruction. But the precepts were clear. An overwhelming response to a minor threat was wasteful. It expended resources and revealed capabilities. The goal was never just to win. The goal was to win with the least possible expenditure and zero risk. That was the Thorian way. The vessel's propulsion system, Vorlag stated, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the iron of his throne. It was not a question. Exposed and clearly delineated War Primus, Tyr confirmed instantly. The chaotic energy output makes it an unmissable target. They are venting drive plasma from a fractured containment ring. Vorlag's gaze remained fixed on the small, helpless ship. They would not destroy it. Destruction taught an enemy nothing but fear, and fear could curdle into a desire for vengeance. A lesson was a far more valuable outcome. Crippling the intruder would force a surrender. It would allow for the capture of the vessel and its crew. The intelligence gained from their databanks and their minds would be infinitely more useful than a cloud of expanding wreckage. He would learn who they were, where they came from, and why they had dared to intrude upon his watch. A clean, logical, risk-free solution. He considered the fate of the beings aboard that ship. They were almost certainly short-lived creatures, a flicker of existence measured in mere decades. Such beings were often erratic, prone to grand gestures and foolish sacrifices born of desperation. Their mortality made them unpredictable but also fragile. A precise, disciplinary strike would shock them into compliance. It was, in its own way, a mercy. It would end their foolish posturing before it led to complete annihilation. A single, elegant weapon system was required for this task. The hegemon's will was equipped with a forward-facing cohesion lance. Unlike a wide-beam plasma cannon designed for planetary bombardment, the lance fired a tightly focused beam of energized particles. It was designed for surgical strikes, slicing through a capital ship's spine or disabling a specific subsystem without damaging the surrounding hull. The perfect tool for this kind of work. Clean, efficient, final. Target their primary drive housing, Vorlag commanded. The words fell into the silent bridge with the finality of a dropped stone. Single cohesion lance, low-yield burn. Target locked, War Primus, Tyr responded. His hands moved over a floating console of hard light. A targeting reticle, a complex pattern of intersecting crimson lines, superimposed itself over the aft section of the human ship on the main screen. The calculation was complete. The solution was elegant. Vorlag gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Fire. He felt no thrill, no surge of adrenaline. There was only the quiet satisfaction of a problem correctly identified and a solution perfectly executed. His duty here was done. Subcommander Tyr would oversee the capture and containment of the disabled vessel. His own attention was already turning to more pressing matters: fleet logistics, munitions reports from the outer patrol, the slow, patient erosion of the Kreth presence near the Cygnus Arm. The fate of the small ship was already a settled affair in his mind, a footnote in the day's log. Across the silent void, a needle of pure white light erupted from the bow of the hegemon's will. It did not thunder or roar. It was as silent as the vacuum it crossed, a line of perfect energy drawn between cause and effect. It moved with impossible speed, a surgeon's blade on its way to make a clean, precise incision. The ephemeral calculus of a brief and violent first contact was about to be solved. There was no sound, only pressure. A wave of force slammed through the Pathfinder's hull, a physical blow that threw Ali's Gentry against a diagnostics console. The universe dissolved into a smear of pain and the shriek of tortured metal. Then came the darkness. The ship's gentle hum died, replaced by a profound, ringing silence that was somehow worse than the noise. A moment later, emergency power flickered on, bathing the bridge in the hellish red glow of crisis lighting. Alarms blared, a discordant symphony of failure. Heavy thuds echoed through the deck plates as emergency bulkheads slammed into place, sealing off compromised sections. Alice pushed herself up, her head swimming. Across the bridge, Captain Rostand lay on the floor, clutching an arm bent at an unnatural angle. Mr. Ames was struggling to get back into his chair, a line of blood tracing a path from his hairline to his jaw. But the captain's eyes were open, sharp, and fixed on the main view screen. The starfield was gone. In its place, a colossal alien warship hung against the black, its angular, brutalist lines radiating menace. "Report," Captain Rostand ordered, her voice a low growl of pain and command. She used her good arm to pull herself into a sitting position against the base of her command chair. Mr. Ames wiped blood from his face, his fingers trembling as they flew over his console. "We've been hit. A single plasma bolt to the stern, starboard side. Main power is offline. The drive housing is fractured." He paused, his face paling in the red light. "Captain, it's bleeding radiation. Containment is failing." "Dead in the water." The words echoed in Alice's mind, a cold certainty that settled deep in her gut. They were adrift, crippled, and leaking the very energies that had brought them here. Life support was already flagging, the air growing thin and cold. The alien vessel began to move, a predator closing in on wounded prey. A hail came through, a burst of static and guttural clicks that the translation software struggled to parse into a garbled mess of demands and threats. Surrender was not an offer. It was a prelude to an execution. "Alice," the captain's voice cut through her fear, steel-edged and absolute. "Get to engineering. Tell me what you can do." Alice didn't hesitate. She scrambled from the bridge, a hand torch cutting a sharp white beam through the darkened corridors. The ship groaned around her, a dying beast. She found the engineering bay in chaos. Sparks rained from severed conduits, and the air tasted of ozone and hot metal. The heart of the chamber, the housing for the quantum drive, was a ruin. A spiderweb of cracks marred its mirrored surface, and a faint, sickly green light pulsed from within, a visible sign of the decay of fundamental forces. The containment field was collapsing. They had minutes at best before the whole section was flooded with lethal energy. The drive was designed to fold space, to create a momentary, survivable paradox. Now its delicate balance was shattered. It was a bomb counting down to a detonation that would atomize them without a trace. Her mind raced, fueled by a terror so pure it felt like clarity. The failure was a cascade, but it was not yet instantaneous. There was still power flowing, still a system trying to regulate an impossible state. The reaction could be vented. It was an emergency protocol of last resort, designed to eject the core into space. But what if they did not just eject it? She keyed her comm, her throat tight. "Captain, it's bad. The containment field is failing. We're going to breach." "How long?" Rostand's voice replied, devoid of any tremor. 10 minutes, maybe less," Alice said, her eyes fixed on the pulsing green light. "But there might be something else, an option." She took a shaky breath. "The core is unstable, but the reaction is still coherent. We can't restart the drive, but we can vent the entire charge through the main exhaust port, all at once." A long silence stretched over the comm. Alice could hear the distant shriek of warping metal, the death rattles of their ship. "Explain," the captain finally said. "It's a controlled detonation," Alice clarified, her voice barely a whisper. "We use the magnetic conduits to shape the energy release. We turn our engine into a weapon. The odds are they're not good. The feedback could vaporize us instantly. If we miscalculate the energy dynamics, we just become a bigger bomb." She swallowed hard. "But if it works, we might just rip a hole clean through them." Another pause, this one shorter. When the captain spoke again, her voice held no doubt, no fear, only a chilling resolve. It was the sound of a decision made outside the cold calculus of survival percentages. "Our lives are our own, Alice," Captain Rostand said, her tone absolute. "We don't give them away for nothing, do it." From the command throne of the hegemon's will, War Primus Vorlag watched the primitive vessel with a dispassionate eye. The disciplinary strike had performed exactly as the precepts of scale dictated. The enemy ship was crippled, venting plasma and atmosphere into the void. A satisfying, if predictable, outcome. Subcommander Tyr stood at his side, his posture rigid. "War Primus, their primary reactor is showing signs of imminent failure. They are glowing." Vorlag leaned forward slightly, observing the telltale energy bloom on his tactical display. A reactor breach. The final, clumsy failure of a technologically inferior race. He felt a flicker of something almost like pity. It was a pathetic end. To be brought so low by a single, precise shot demonstrated a fatal lack of discipline in their engineering and their command. They had entered Thorian space without permission, and they would die for their ignorance. He had been prepared to offer them the honor of a warrior's capture, to interrogate them and learn the nature of their foolish species. Now, they would deny him even that. Then something changed. The energy signature did not blossom into the chaotic, expanding sphere of a typical reactor failure. It coalesced, it focused. The readings on the tactical display spiked, climbing past every known threshold for a ship of that size and class. The numbers turned red, then vanished, replaced by error symbols his sensor technicians had likely never seen before. A focused beam of raw, incandescent power erupted from the human ship's stern. It was not an explosion. It was a directed act of impossible violence. The beam was a lance of pure quantum chaos, a torrent of energies that should not exist outside the heart of a collapsing star. It moved with unnatural speed, crossing the void between the ships in less than a heartbeat. Vorlag's mind, trained for millennia in the art of calculated warfare, could not process the event's sheer impossibility. An alarm shrieked across the bridge, a piercing, unfamiliar sound he had not heard since his days as a junior officer. It was the sound of shields failing. The Thorian warship was protected by kinetic barriers. These layers of projected force could deflect nearly any conventional energy or projectile, dispersing the impact across the ship's formidable hull. But the human weapon was not conventional. It did not strike the barriers, it unmade them. The beam of pure paradox tore through the layers of energy as if they were mist. It struck the armored prow of the hegemon's will with the force of a divine judgment. There was no explosion, only a silent, terrible fission. Adamantine plating, forged in the heart of the anvil itself, vaporized. A molten trench miles long was carved deep into the warship's hull, slicing through decks and bulkheads with contemptuous ease. On the bridge, screens went dark. Consoles sparked and died. The deck pitched violently, sending crew members sprawling. Through the forward viewport, Vorlag stared at the gash in his own vessel, a glowing, crimson wound bleeding fire and atmosphere into the cold vacuum. His subcommander stared, his mouth agape, his composure utterly shattered. The impossible had happened. The gnat had bitten the giant, and it had drawn blood. Silence pressed down on the bridge of the hegemon's will, a heavy blanket smothering the echoes of the intruder's final, insane gambit. The attack had been a primal scream of energy, a focused lance of raw drive plasma that had gouged a molten trench across the warship's forward armor. Systems shrieked for a moment, then stabilized. The damage was superficial, a mere flesh wound to a leviathan, but the intent behind it left War Primus Vorlag reeling. A cold fury warred with a disorienting sense of confusion. It was an act of pure madness. The odds of their own survival had been zero. There was no tactical advantage to be gained, no victory to be snatched from the jaws of defeat. They had simply chosen to die in a blaze of useless defiance. "Report," Vorlag commanded, his voice a low growl that cut through the sterile quiet. "The enemy vessel is inert, War Primus," Subcommander Tyr stated, his 4 eyes fixed on the tactical display. "No power signatures, no life support. It is a dead thing floating in the anvil's light." Vorlag stared at the image of the small, scarred ship. It was a piece of debris, an insignificant piece of cosmic junk, yet it had struck him. It had dared to strike him. The sheer irrationality of it was an insult more profound than any weapon could deliver. The precepts of scale had no entry for this, no formula to calculate the actions of a foe who did not value their own existence. He would have answers. He would dissect this anomaly until he understood its every component. "Bring it in," Vorlag ordered. He gestured toward the main view screen. "Secure it in the primary hangar. I want it taken apart piece by piece." He ordered a tractor field to envelop the crippled human vessel. A network of shimmering blue energy coalesced around the dead ship, a cage of pure force that began to pull the silent hull steadily toward the open maw of the hegemon's will. The immense bay doors slid open, revealing a cavernous space large enough to swallow the intruder whole. This was a violation, a deep and personal intrusion into the heart of his warship, but it was necessary. His finest soldiers stood ready in the hangar, their armored carapaces gleaming under the harsh industrial lights. They were the first claw warriors bred for boarding actions and close-quarters combat. When the captured ship finally settled into its magnetic clamps with a low groan of metal, they moved. They advanced in perfect, silent formations, breaching the enemy airlock with a controlled explosive charge that barely echoed in the vastness of the bay. They flowed into the dark corridors like a river of polished chrome and retribution, their helmet-mounted optics cutting through the gloom. The reports came back to the bridge in a steady, emotionless stream. The bridge was a charnel house. Vorlag watched on a secondary screen as the armored figures moved through the wreckage. The alien captain was slumped in her command chair, her body still and broken. The helm officer was dead. The science officer was dead. Most of the crew had been vaporized by the backlash of their own suicidal weapon. The first claw methodically documented each corpse, their movements economical and devoid of any sentiment. They were cataloging evidence, not mourning the fallen. "We have survivors," Tyr announced, his tone flat. "A small group. They sealed themselves in an aft storage compartment." "How many?" Vorlag asked, his gaze not leaving the screen. "5," Tyr replied. "Minimal resistance. They appear to be in shock. One matches the energy signature profile of the drive technician." The technician, the one who had likely conceived of and executed the attack. Vorlag felt a flicker of something akin to interest. He would meet this creature who thought in such alien geometries of logic. He would learn what drove a being to turn its own heart into a bomb. But first, he needed data. The mind of a single crew member could be flawed, broken, or deliberately misleading. The mind of their ship, however, would tell the truth. Its data core was the ultimate prize. While the few human survivors were marched to the brig under heavy guard, his xenotechs began their work. These specialists in alien technology and biology worked with chilling speed, their multi-jointed fingers flying across holographic interfaces as they dissected the ship's digital soul. They bypassed the primitive security layers with contemptuous ease, peeling back the layers of the machine's memory. Information flooded Vorlag's command console. Ship designation, Pathfinder. Class, survey vessel. A ship of science, not war. The absurdity of the situation deepened. He watched as the xenotechs uncovered the vessel's primary mission logs. They were filled with stellar cartography, spectral analysis of nebulae, and biological surveys of lifeless worlds. There was no hint of aggression, no sign of military purpose. Then the xenotechs breached a deeper layer of the core, a protected archive. It was not a military file. It was a library, a vast repository of the species' identity. Vorlag leaned forward, his focus narrowing. This was the answer. The species called itself human. The database was a sprawling encyclopedia of their culture. Vorlag watched simulations of their history, a chaotic and brutal series of self-inflicted wars followed by periods of astonishing artistic creation. He saw their paintings, listened to their music, a discordant but strangely compelling blend of mathematical patterns and raw emotion. He read their philosophies, their desperate attempts to find meaning in a cosmos that offered none. He saw images of their worlds, teeming with life in a billion different forms. It was a species of profound contradictions, capable of both sublime beauty and breathtaking savagery. They were a young race, barely a flicker in the galaxy's long life. But there was something else, a single piece of biological data so astounding that Vorlag was certain it was a miscalculation. "Tyr," he said, his voice quiet, "confirm the biological data on species' lifespan." The subcommander turned to his own console, his appendages tapping a quick query. He froze. He ran the query again. The result was the same. "War Primus," Tyr said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "The data indicates a maximum viable lifespan of approximately 100 of their solar cycles." Vorlag stared at the number on his screen. 100 years. It was a laughable, sickeningly small amount of time. A Thorian was considered an adolescent at 100 years. A Thorian warrior did not even begin their prime until their second century. He had war claws older than the entire lifespan of these creatures. It had to be an error in translation, a corruption in the data. "Isolate the raw data," Vorlag commanded. "Cross-reference it with their medical logs, their historical records, their family lineages." The xenotechs complied. The result did not change. It was confirmed over and over from a dozen different sources within the archive. Their brightest minds, their greatest leaders, their most beloved artists, all of them lived their frantic, compressed lives and then simply ended. They winked out of existence in less time than it took a Thorian to master a single combat form. The revelation settled over Vorlag not with a crash, but with a creeping, chilling cold. Everything recontextualized itself in his mind. The suicidal charge, the weaponized engine, the sacrifice of the bridge crew to save a handful of others. It was not a desperate gamble made by beings who valued their lives. It was a calculated expenditure by beings whose lives were worth almost nothing to begin with. Their entire existence was a rounding error. Subcommander Tyr looked from the data to the image of the captured humans huddled in their cell. "They are ephemeral," he mused, the thought spoken aloud. "Like insects, their strategy makes no sense. They threw their lives away for nothing." Vorlag slowly shook his head, the armored plates of his neck scraping together. A dread he had never known, a deep and fundamental uncertainty began to coil in his gut. He had faced down the Voidkin in the empty spaces and battled the temporal machinations of the Vex Eternal. He had never felt fear. He felt it now. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it filled the bridge with its terrible weight. "We have miscalculated." He looked at Tyr, his own eyes reflecting the horrifying new paradigm. "We assumed they value existence as we do. We assumed their calculus was the same as ours." He turned back to the screen, to the image of the human drive technician, Ali's Gentry, staring at the wall of her cell with an expression he could not decipher. It was not fear. It was not despair. It was something else entirely. "We were wrong," Vorlag finished, the words tasting like ash. The cell was a monument to nothing. Its walls were a shade of gray that absorbed light and optimism in equal measure. There was no bed, only a shallow depression in the floor. There was no window, only a featureless door and a soft, sourceless light that never changed. Ali's Gentry sat in the depression, her knees drawn to her chest, and she watched. She was a prisoner, yes, but before that she was an engineer, an observer. The core of her remained unchanged, and so she did what she had always done. She analyzed the system. Her captors were the system's most visible component. The Thorian guards were enormous, encased in dark, functional armor that made the deck plates hum with their passing. Yet they moved with a ponderous grace, a deliberate slowness that felt less like discipline and more like a profound reluctance. They never ran. They checked every corridor with methodical, overlapping scans. When one entered her cell to deliver the nutrient paste that passed for food, its movements were a study in risk aversion. Each step was planted, each motion economical and free of haste. Ali saw it then, a startling moment of clarity in the gray monotony. They were terrified of endings. Their long lives were not a strength, but a cage, each century adding another bar of caution, another layer of fear around the simple act of existence. The moment she had been waiting for arrived without ceremony. The cell door hissed open, and two guards stood silhouetted against the brighter light of the corridor. One gestured with its weapon. It was time for her interrogation. They flanked her, their magnetic boots locking to the deck with heavy clicks, marching her through the alien vessel's sterile hallways. Ali's kept her head down, feigning submission, but her eyes darted everywhere, cataloging junction boxes, power conduits, and access panels. It was all a machine, and every machine had its tolerances. Every machine could be broken. Ahead, a heavy bulkhead door cycled open. For a half-second, as she passed through the frame, she was next to an exposed service conduit. Its shimmering containment field, a transparent wall of energy, held back the raw power flowing within. This was the pressure point. Drawing on a desperate trick from an old Academy simulation, a lesson in controlled sabotage, she palmed a thin metal shard she had stripped from the inside of her sleeve. She jammed it into a tiny diagnostic port at the conduit's base. The effect was immediate. A surge of mismatched energy feedback overloaded the local emitter. The containment field did not fail, but it flickered violently, its steady glow stuttering into a frantic strobe. For 30 seconds, the shield's integrity would be compromised. It was enough. The guards reacted to the power fluctuation with predictable caution, turning to assess the threat, their weapons raised. They did not react to her. She was the lesser variable, the known quantity. That was their mistake. Ali's lunged the other way, toward a small, recessed panel on the opposite wall. It was a low-level comms panel, the kind a maintenance drone might use to report its status to a central hub. Her fingers, small and nimble compared to the Thorians, flew across the touch-sensitive surface. The interface was alien, but the logic was universal. Power, frequency, data packet, destination. A prearranged human emergency channel, a desperate shot in the dark across the interstellar void. She did not have time to compose a message. There was no time for words, for pleas, for explanations. She sent only data, a compressed packet containing her analysis of Thorian psychology, their caution, their fear of the unknown, their obsession with predictable outcomes. And with it, she sent a plan. It was not a request for rescue. It was a strategic directive, cold and horrifyingly precise. It was a gambit that traded her life and the lives of the other survivors for a chance. It was a plan that asked for a fleet, and it asked for a volunteer to do the unthinkable. The entire proposal was built around a piece of ancient, terrifying technology humanity had only recently unearthed. The plan's linchpin was the Void Beacon. The device was a transmitter of immense and poorly understood power, one capable of sending a signal into realities that were not their own. Humanity did not know who or what might be listening on the other side. The Sporax, the Vex Eternal, or things far, far older. Activating it was the ultimate act of desperation. a scream into an abyss that might answer with annihilation. Her message was an instruction to bring one of those devices to this sector and to make the Thorians aware of it. Her psychological analysis was blunt. The Thorians would never risk an unknown, galaxy-ending variable for the sake of a single captured ship. They would be paralyzed by the sheer, incalculable risk. The plan was to make them believe that humanity was not just reckless but pathologically insane. That they would burn down an entire sector of space, themselves included, simply to spite a captor. Her data packet was a lit fuse, and she had just thrown it into the most orderly, cautious powder magazine in the galaxy. A massive hand closed around her shoulder, lifting her from the deck as if she weighed nothing. The second guard covered her with its weapon, its stance a perfect, practiced expression of threat control. The containment field on the service conduit stabilized, its shimmer returning to a placid, steady glow. The flickering lights in the corridor ceased their frantic dance. The crisis was over. The panel in front of her went dark, its access severed. But the signal was away. A single, tight burst of information, screaming into the void toward anyone listening. It was a whisper that carried the weight of a thunderclap. Alice let her body go limp in the guard's grip. They dragged her down the hall, her feet scraping against the metal deck. There was no triumph on her face, only a chilling emptiness. She had just gambled with the fate of worlds on a psychological theory formed in a gray cell. She had studied her enemy, found the gear that could not be stressed, and applied all the pressure she could muster. She had embraced the ephemeral nature of her own short, violent human life and turned it into a weapon. The Thorians calculated every possibility to ensure their survival. She had just handed them a calculation with no possible solution. War Primus Vorlag stood upon the command dais of the hegemon's will, a monument of cold steel and colder certainty. Before him, the Starforge known as the Anvil burned with the fury of captured suns. Into this sacred space, a new anomaly had appeared. A small flotilla of human ships, barely a squadron, hung at the edge of the system's gravity well. Their energy signatures were pathetic. Their designs were an ugly composite of mismatched modules. Vorlag's tactical displays painted them as prey, a trivial nuisance to be swept aside. His fleet, a wall of disciplined might, awaited the inevitable order. He would grant it soon. Then the lead human vessel began to change. Its central spine bloomed with a pale, sickly light. A resonance washed over the Thorian bridge. It was not a sound traveling through vacuum, but one clawing directly at the mind. Vorlag felt a deep, ancestral shudder. This was the Void Beacon, a forbidden relic of a forgotten age. The device was an antenna not for messages, but for summoning things that should remain sleeping in the absolute dark. The low, psychic hum felt like grit in his thoughts, a promise of cosmic horror. His long-lived people had spent millennia trying to forget it. Vorlag's blood, usually slow and cool, turned to ice. Every Thorian knew the legends whispered in the clan nurseries. The beacon did not call allies. It screamed into the intergalactic void, an open invitation to the unlife that dwelled there. It called the Voidkin. They were eaters of light, unravelers of physics. A form of existence so alien it was a contagion to reality itself. He saw the human strategy in a flash of sickening clarity. They had not come to fight. They had come to die and take the entire Anvil system, his clan, and his flagship with them. They were threatening mutual annihilation, a concept so foreign to the Thorian calculus of survival it felt like a form of madness. All ships full power, Vorlag's voice was a guttural roar. All condescension burned away by raw fear. Destroy that lead vessel, do not let it broadcast for one more cycle. The command was an echo of his own desperation. His fleet, a perfectly arranged instrument of war, abandoned its stately formations. They surged forward in a chaotic, headlong rush. Their immense engines tore at space-time. Every weapon aboard every ship locked onto the single, glowing point of light that promised a doom far worse than simple battle. As the Thorian armada charged, a single ship detached from the human flotilla, a freighter stripped of its cargo pods and most of its outer plating, a skeletal frame around a grotesquely oversized engine. The vessel, named the Last Word, accelerated on a direct intercept course. Its quantum drive flared with an intensity that should have torn the small ship apart, a gnat flying into the maw of a leviathan. Inside the rattling cockpit of that gnat, Tomer Baines kept his hands steady on the controls. The vibration was a living thing trying to shake his bones into dust. He ignored it. He thought of his wife's smile and the weight of his daughter on his shoulders. A lifetime. Not a long one by galactic standards, but packed with a richness the Thorians, with their endless, cautious years, could never comprehend. He had loved and been loved. That was enough. He sent a final, silent thought to his family, a simple farewell crossing the light years in an instant. Tomer Baines was not afraid. He was an answer. Vorlag saw the lone freighter on his main tactical display. He dismissed it instantly. A sacrificial pincer, a distraction to draw fire. Its weapon signatures were non-existent. Its mass was too low to do meaningful damage upon impact with their shields. The Thorian gunners ignored it, their focus entirely on the terrifying hum of the beacon. A logical, calculated assessment of threat. A fatal mistake. The freighter was not a weapon in the way the Thorians understood weapons. It was a delivery system for a concept. The freighter did not fire. It did not try to ram the hegemon's will. As it entered optimal range, nestled deep within the charging Thorian fleet, Tomer Baines slammed a single, unguarded switch. He initiated a quantum jump, a maneuver forbidden by every law of physics and sanity. A jump with no programmed exit, inside an active gravity well, surrounded by dozens of other energy fields. An act of pure, suicidal lunacy. For a horrifying fraction of a second, the last word ceased to be a single object. It became a shimmering, probabilistic cloud, existing in 1,000 places at once throughout the Thorian formation. Then its overloaded quantum drive pushed far beyond every imaginable limit breached containment. There was no fireball, no sound, no shockwave of expanding gas. The drive simply unraveled. It tore a hole in the fabric of the universe. From that hole spilled a wave of silent, shimmering non-reality, a tide of pure paradox, an expanding bubble of fractured spacetime. This was not an explosion of energy, but the cancellation of physical law itself. Vorlag watched, paralyzed, as the wave washed over his fleet. Shields did not stop it. Armor did not deflect it. They simply ceased to be coherent. A destroyer to his port side dissolved into a cloud of drifting atoms. Its crew blinked out of existence between one heartbeat and the next. Another vessel was twisted into an impossible shape, its front and back halves occupying the same space before vanishing. The wave hit his own flagship. The forward third of the mighty hegemon's will was shorn away, as if it had never been built. Alarms shrieked into a vacuum of understanding. The wave dissipated. It left behind a scene of absolute violation. A third of his fleet was gone, not destroyed, not broken into wreckage, but erased. The silent void was littered with the remaining ships, crippled and tumbling. Their crews screamed into their comms. Vorlag stood frozen on his ruined bridge. The cold of space touched his face through a cracked viewport. He finally understood. The human weapon was not their technology, it was their acceptance. He had just witnessed the terrifying, tactical application of a single man's willingness to die. It had broken the back of his undefeatable fleet. The last of the human ships vanished. One moment they were there, a defiant cluster of lights against the bruised velvet of the anvil. The next, they were gone. They left behind a silence more profound than any scream. The void beacon, that terrible lighthouse summoning nightmares from the deep, fell quiet. Its suffocating hum was replaced by the low groan of dying metal and the distant, thin cries of the wounded. War Primus Vorlag stood on the bridge of the hegemon's will, a monarch reigning over a kingdom of ruin. Sparks rained down from the ceiling like bitter funeral rites. Consoles were shattered, their screens dark or displaying patterns of terminal error. His crew, the finest of his clan, lay broken around him. Some were still, their long lives cut short. Others stirred feebly, their calls for aid lost in the echoing expanse. Outside the fractured viewport, his fleet was a graveyard. Hulls torn open, venting atmosphere in silent, glittering plumes. Ships drifted aimlessly, their engines cold, their spines snapped. Among them, things still moved. Remnants of the Voidkin, those unthings birthed from the dead pilot's final act, clung to the wreckage like cosmic carrion. They fed on the lingering energy and terror. Vorlag's mind, a thing of precise calculation and military doctrine, tried to process the scene. He tried to apply the precepts of scale to quantify the losses and formulate a response. The attempt was futile. It was like trying to measure a ghost with a ruler. The logic that had governed his entire existence, every victory, had been rendered meaningless. He thought of the human pilot, the one who had flown into the heart of his armada in a ship built for speed and nothing more. Vorlag had dismissed him, a gnat to be swatted. The gnat had not stung. It had become a gateway to hell. No Thorian would ever do such a thing. Not in a millennium of warfare had one of their own volunteered for such a final, absolute act of self-erasure. A Thorian life was a vessel for centuries of experience, a library of memories and skills to be protected at all costs. A single consciousness was a sacred archive. To these humans, it was ammunition, a resource to be expended, a currency traded for a tactical advantage. The thought was so alien, so deeply heretical, it made him physically sick. They did not value their lives. No, that was wrong. They valued them so much they were willing to spend them. A chime, clean and clear, cut through the cacophony of alarms. On the primary view screen, the static and damage reports vanished. A single, stable comms window appeared. A recorded message broadcast on a looping, open channel. It came from the human ship he had crippled, the Pathfinder. A woman's face filled the screen. Captain Eva Rostand. Her skin was bruised. A cut marked her temple, but her eyes were clear. They were not the eyes of a defeated prisoner. They were the eyes of a teacher giving a final, terrible lesson. "War Primus," she said, her voice steady and devoid of malice, a voice of pure, chilling fact. "You are learning about us now. We do not have the luxury of your long years. Our lives are a flash of lightning in the dark. Because they are short, they are precious beyond your understanding," Rostand continued. Her gaze seemed to bore through the screen into his soul. "We will fight for every second. We will trade one life for two of our own. We will trade 1,000 to save 1,000,000. We will burn our entire species down to the last soul to ensure our children have a future." The recording ended. Her face vanished, replaced once more by the view of his shattered fleet. The silence she left behind was heavy with understanding. It settled over Vorlag, a shroud of cold, irrefutable truth, not madness, not desperation. A calculus, just as his precepts of scale were a calculus. But the variables were different. His equations were built on asset preservation, on the sanctity of the individual unit. Theirs were built on the survival of the species, where the individual was a willing, even eager, sacrifice. An ephemeral calculus, a single brief life multiplied by the infinite value of the future. He finally understood. He had not been fighting a fledgling spacefaring race. He had not been fighting ships or weapons. He had been fighting a biological imperative, a philosophy forged in the crucible of short, desperate lives. He had picked a fight with a species that weaponized its own mortality. How could his people, who cherished their long centuries, who planned for millennia, ever hope to defeat an enemy that fought as if every single day was their last? They could not. It was a strategic and spiritual impossibility. He had been fighting time itself, and he had lost. With a monumental effort, Vorlag straightened his spine. He was no longer the proud war primus of a mighty hegemony. He was a messenger bearing a warning born of fire and death. He activated his command channel. The signal reached out to the crippled remnants of his authority. He did not know how many were left to hear it. It did not matter. The message had to be sent. "Withdraw," he commanded, his voice a raw rasp carrying across the wreckage of his ambition. The order was simple, absolute. "Mark this species' territory as a quarantine zone. In their language, the classification is this: do not provoke." He paused. He let the words sink into the stunned silence of his surviving commanders. They had to understand the nature of this defeat. They had to know why his entire clan must never make the same mistake. "Their acceptance of mortality," Vorlag stated, his voice grim and final, "is a strategic weapon for which we have no counter." He closed the channel. The great warship Hegemon's will, a wounded beast, began the agonizingly slow process of turning away from the battlefield. Vorlag stared out at the scar in space, the lingering wound from a single human pilot, a gnat that had become a gateway. He watched the void where the human ships had vanished. They were gone, but their lesson remained, burned into his mind and his fleet. The galaxy would never be the same. The Thorian hegemony had met humanity. And it had learned the one thing it could not calculate: the price of a life that knew its own brevity.